Major funding for Odyssey was provided by National Endowment for the Humanities. Additional funding was provided by Corporation for Public Broadcasting and Polaroid.
He was the very last among us to be able to cover the whole field of anthropology. He was altogether a linguist, a physical anthropologist, an archaeologist, a field worker, and a theoretician.
The value of anthropology is its power to impress us with the relative value of all forms of culture, for we are only too liable to consider our civilization the ultimate goal of human evolution, thus depriving ourselves of the benefits to be gained from the teachings of others. My whole outlook upon life is determined by one question: how can we recognize the shackles that tradition has laid upon us? For when we recognize them, we are also able to break them.
Boas was always, above all, a scientist. He was a physicist by training. His doctoral dissertation was in physics, but it was on a peculiar topic. It had also a geographical aspect. He was interested in the factors determining the color of seawater, and he was led from this to a consideration of the general problem of the human perception of the environment. And that's why he went to Baffinland. He wanted to see how the Eskimos' knowledge of the land in which they lived compared to the actual geographical terrain as it would be plotted by a geographer, namely himself.
The Eskimos are my companions in all my journeys, and their fortunes are my fortunes. It was at this time that I learned to know the Eskimo hospitality. I often ask myself what advantages our good society has over that of savages. The more I see of their customs, the more I realize that we have no right to look down on them. For me, the most important result of this trip lies in the strengthening of my point of view that the idea of a cultured individual is merely relative, and that a person's worth should be judged by the warmth of his heart.
This was a period in which modern anti-Semitism was beginning to be manifest, and it was something that Boas had experienced personally as a student. He had scars on his face, which he told some people he got from being clawed by a polar bear, but actually they were dueling scars that he'd gotten in duels that he'd fought as a student over anti-Semitic remarks.
Why did I want to leave Germany in 1885? The main reason was probably that I wanted to get married, but there was more behind it. The anti-Semitism during my university years and the idea that America was politically an ideal country seemed to have been the main motives.
The immigrants that came to America expected that they would, in fact, and very seriously, find life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. It was the first time, in fact, that it was ever said anywhere that all men are created equal. And they believed it. And so did Boas. And all his scientific work continues along that line.
The beginnings of my researches in the Pacific Northwest date back to 1885. I was working in the Royal Ethnographic Museum of Berlin, cataloging the collection of Bella Coola masks. My fancy was struck by the flight of imagination in the works of art. I could see that a wealth of thought lay hidden behind the grotesque masks of these tribes. The attraction became irresistible, and with the financial aid of personal friends, I was enabled to visit the coast of British Columbia in the fall of 1886. The Pacific coast here forms an inextricable net of channels and fjords. Numerous islands form a narrow passage of water from the southern tip of British Columbia up to Alaska, through which the ships glide as if on a river. This is a primeval country in all its loneliness. For Europeans, it is interesting to see nature so free. I am anxious to know how I shall fare when I really get to work. This area is inhabited by a great many Indian tribes, distinct in physical characteristics and distinct in languages. Their arts, customs, and beliefs differ so much from those of all other Indians that they form one of the best defined cultural groups on our continent. A hasty glance at these people emphasizes the uniformity of their culture, but closer investigation reveals many peculiarities of individual tribes, which prove that their culture has developed slowly and from a number of distinct centers. We must remember that every primitive people has had a long history. It may have descended by decay from a stage of higher development, or it may have risen to its present stage, battling against vicissitudes. The rapid spread of American civilization is working deep changes even in these parts of the country which until recently were uninfluenced by the culture of the white man. It is a question of only a few years when everything reminding us of America as it was at the time of its discovery will have perished. It is a duty that we owe not only to our own country but to future generations to save this knowledge.
Anthropology developed in the wake of the expansion of white people out of Europe and the subsequent conquest of America, Africa, Asia, and the South Sea Islands. The conquest of the colored peoples who lived in those areas. Now, anthropology developed race as a means of explaining and justifying this conquest, this exploitation, this humiliation.
Biological differences between races are small. There's no reason to believe that one race is by nature so much more intelligent, endowed with greater willpower, nor emotionally more stable than another.
Boas introduced a new way of looking at race. Boas was the first distinguished white social scientist in the United States who minimized the importance of race as a determinant of human behavior.
The whole basis of the anthropological viewpoint is the willingness to take the position of the nonconformist not to take anything in our social structure for granted, and to be particularly ready to examine critically all those attitudes that are accompanied by strong outbursts of emotion. The last few weeks I spent at the north tip of Vancouver Island and lived with the Indians in their homes, celebrated their festivals with them. These surroundings remind me so vividly of the time spent with the Eskimo, and among them, only one white man. The fundamental idea underlying the thoughts, feelings, and activities of these tribes is the value of rank. Rank and social position bestow the privilege to use certain animal figures as paintings or carvings on house fronts, on totem poles, on masks, and on the utensils of everyday life. My hopes of finding much material of scientific value here have been justified. I went to a place where there are Indian graves. It is most unpleasant work to steal bones from a grave, but it must be done for scientific study. I dreamed of skull and bones last night, but the collection is very instructive. Examination of these skulls shows that the individual tribes speaking the same language vary considerably from each other.
Boas brought a critical perspective to American anthropology. The United States was a deeply troubled country on his arrival in the 1880s. The nagging emerging truth was that people were unequal, and many of them were miserable. And most of Boas' contemporaries in American anthropology used their science to justify and explain inequality. Boas came as an outsider to this society, as a marginal man, and he was beginning clearly to challenge the assumptions of cultural superiority and progress that lay at the foundation of social evolutionism.
The two branches of American anthropology which were entrusted to me at the World's Columbian exhibit were the physical anthropology of the North American Indian and the ethnology of the North Pacific coast. Both fields now stand on an entirely new basis.
The exposition was a high-water mark of interest in Romantic anthropology. Victorian Americans were clearly fascinated by savage life. But there was little room for science at Chicago. He had hoped to teach, of all things, statistics in the laboratory of physical anthropology. But the crowds only wanted to have their heads measured at 50 cents apiece by the latest instruments. The crowds came to the exhibits of primitive people on the Midway, including the Kwakiutl group that Boas had brought from the northwest coast. Boas found himself more frequently entertaining than educating the American public. As a result of this, for a moralist of the 19th century like Boas, for a man who believed in the moral education of the public, Chicago must have been a depressing experience.
The strenuous duties of my position as chief assistant of the Department of Anthropology during the exposition did not give me much time for research. However, I was able to work with George Hunt, who was in charge of a number of Kwakiutl Indians at the fair. Together, we began to collect some prose texts.
At the end of the fair, he had expected to be appointed curator of anthropology at the new Field Museum. But he was passed over for the job, and he left Chicago with great bitterness. Boas returned to the northwest coast in an unsettled, unhappy state. These were desperately unhappy years for Boas, professionally and personally.
Sweet wife, I'm so impatient for your letters. They arrive so seldom that when I receive a packet, I always look at your last letter quickly to find out that you're all well. How terrible all this financial insecurity is. What are my children doing? Will they recognize their papa when he comes back? Be patient with the little worms. Make life easy for them. The photographer from Victoria, Mr. Hastings, came as we agreed. I busied myself with taking pictures. If the plates turn out all right, I'll have really good group pictures. I had to laugh yesterday. The people are curious to see the pictures from the back of the camera. I was just about to photograph a woman when somebody noticed that the picture in the camera was upside down. And they ran away, telling everybody that her clothes had fallen over her head. These pictures have given me the idea of writing a popular, or maybe a semi-popular book on this part of the country. I think it could be quite a good book. When I come back, I'll try to sell the pictures to Scribner or to another magazine.
The scientist in Boas was at work in making these photographs because much of the anthropometric work that he did, the measuring of native subjects, was accompanied by documentary photographs taken at specific angles so that one would have a record of what the head shape of these individuals was. When it comes to photographs, we have the tendency to think that the photographer always captures reality, that there is no subjectivity involved in the camera. Quite the contrary. The Kwakiutl culture that Boas was most interested in was traditional Kwakiutl culture. When one looks at the larger frame, it's evident that in order to create traditional Kwakiutl culture, that Boas in fact did have to recreate it. For he's shown here holding a blanket, blocking out what is really present in Fort Rupert in 1894, a white-style house and a picket fence. By looking at Boas's photographs, we can learn something about Boas the man, something about Boas the anthropologist, and something about the culture from which he came and some of the biases that he, as a photographer, had.
The economic system of the Kwakiutl Indians finds its expression in the so-called potlatch. The Indian has no system of writing, and therefore, to give security to transactions, they are performed publicly. This public contracting and paying of debts is the potlatch. It is largely based on credit, just as is the economic system of civilized communities. The standard of value is the blanket, but for larger transactions, objects of imaginary value are used instead, particularly pieces of copper. These might strictly be compared to our banknotes.
Several of the Boas Hastings potlatch photographs document the sale of copper. Boas photographed the village island chief standing, holding his copper prior to its sale. The particular one that was offered for sale, it realized a price at this transaction of 4,200 Hudson's Bay blankets.
The meaning of this custom has been much misunderstood, as shown by the recent ruling by the Canadian government making the potlatch a criminal offense. The sudden abolition of this ceremony destroys all the accumulated capital of the Indians. What wonder that the law should be resisted with vigor by the best class of Indians, and that only the lazy should support it because it relieves them of the duty of paying the debts.
An awful lot of anthropologists have studied the Kwakiutl. We're probably among the most highly anthropologized of native peoples anywhere. And yet of all those people, those anthropologists who have come at different times to study us, none has made a contribution to our lives that equals that of Franz Boas. His value, I think, to us today is that he, together with George Hunt, recorded very carefully and accurately the culture of the Kwakwala-speaking people before the potlatch law was enforced. Because after that law was enforced, potlatching kind of went underground. And many of the people who knew the laws and the rules of potlatching died. We today, who have now been awakened, can go back to those texts and find out for ourselves the proper way of doing things. That work is especially important to me because George Hunt was my great-grandfather.
George Hunt is invaluable to me. He is an interpreter and one of the best collectors we have out here. Although the son of a Tlingit mother and a Scotch father, he grew up at Fort Rupert among the Kwakiutl and took a deep interest in everything pertaining to their ethnology. He began to record material in the Kwakiutl language according to the system of spelling adopted by me.
There is one thing I can say, that there is no man on earth knows more than Dr. Boas about the Kwakiutl tribes.
Kamasisitlas. Emela namakislo khaya lagi so malkhulokta nakwa pagwanam khiskayulas lerto khalakida khaya la bibuk khas khe le om dokhak le namakislo diki dokta nakwa khas qakolat le khis gayulas he mis laqaatsi khida buk.
My dear Dr. Boas, I write to you these few lines to let you know that yours of the 12th of last month came safely to me. I left home for Koskimo on the 14th to find out about the winter dance. What I have seen over there, I will never see again, for all the dances were shown in the really old ways. I took notes, and I made a collection there which I think will please you, for I got most of the people to go and look for old images out of the graves and caves. So you will see them whenever they reach New York.
My dear George, I trust you received my previous letter and the draft for $200 which was sent to you by the museum. I sent you the book a few days ago. You must tell me when I see of all the mistakes I may have made. I know very well that I cannot get everything right unless you help me to do so.
Alice tagi kahilsistat la khesida professor la khida why elas is the back la nikha quilas is le walas haya wela equis leda la tsachis la haya nikha quilas is kaquidas nuquis kaslalas to my Sakwasot la kakwisal la ni na la skise wikstum no kwida la koset lekam la khaya la khaka khaya ba yefeda olekhusla la mtleka dikida so khaya hilsa plis la mla la stamikid la namgid la wida ba.
I met a few friends from the Chicago Museum on a collecting tour. They asked me whether I had seen George Hunt. I was mean enough not to tell them where he was, and I've written George that he should not do anything for them. I have to do this to protect myself.
My dear Dr. Boas, I was very glad to get a letter from you. I was with Mr. Curtis taking old-fashioned Indian-dressed photographs, and he took very few stories. He did not care as long as he got the picture taken. I send you Dr. C.F. Newcomb's 2 letters to me, how he tried to get me to work for him, but I did not want to break the promise I made to you when I told you that I would work for you and not for anyone else.
Thank you for the 2 letters from Dr. Newcomb. I am interested to know that he and the Chicago people wanted to get this West Coast work away from us. I do not think it is exactly nice. When I became the curator of the American Museum of Natural History, I had Mr. Hunt visit New York to arrange the collections made by him and by myself for the museum. The main object of the ethnological collection should be the dissemination of the fact that civilization is not something absolute, but that it is relative, that our ideas and conceptions are true only so far as our civilization goes. What is the function of the large museum? It is the only means of bringing together and of preserving intact large series of material which for all time to come must form the basis of scientific inductions. Museums are storehouses the place where scientific materials from distant countries and the objects used by vanishing tribes are kept and preserved for all future time. It is the essential function of the museum to preserve in the best possible way the valuable material that has been collected and not to allow it to scatter and to deteriorate.
Any large, important museum has most of its collections kept in storage rather than on exhibition. We're now in the North American Indian storage areas of the Smithsonian. These are cedar bark costume ornaments. This is a neck ring from Hamatsa dancers collected by Boas at Fort Rupert in 1894 with George Hunt. They may have been in fact collected by Hunt himself. It was these objects, some of these objects, that Franz Boas posed wearing in 1895 in preparing an exhibit here in the National Museum. He knew how these things were worn and posed taking the part of all of the figures in the group. And he posed one by one, wearing parts of the costume elements that he'd collected. By that time, he had a lot of experience observing and participating in Kwakiutl ceremonies. He'd spent many hours sitting on a bench with a cedar bark robe around his shoulders, watching, taking notes. And photographs were taken of those, from which the sculptors worked in preparing the final exhibit.
Since his disillusionment in Chicago, Boas had come to believe that museum anthropology sacrificed deeper understanding of other cultures to popular appeal. As his Hamatsa pictures show, he gave great attention to facial expression, gesture, and even anatomy, so that the figures of the diorama should be as realistic as possible.
Boas was interested in dance as a form of expressive culture, and one of the dance cycles among the Kwakiutl that interested him from as early as 1894 was the so-called cannibal dances. Boas was interested in looking at the motor habits, the style of movement. When we look further at Boas's intention for this footage, it was quite complex. He was concerned with generating images which would allow him to reconstruct the traditional dance form for what was to be a very innovative diorama for the museum. Once Boas had completed the filming in the Northwest Coast, he took the film back to New York and gave it to an artist. The artist then took individual pictures out of the movie and blew them up to make drawings from the footage. We're able to see the paper positives, the prints that were taken directly from the film. The artist then took the behavior that Boas was interested in and isolated it by drawing around it. Now, of course, what happens in that process of stylization is the clothes disappear, and all evidence of the modern world goes away, and we are back to this traditional time when the Kwakiutl were a culture unto themselves without any Europeans or Americans around. So that his interest in presenting material to the public was exactly opposite from his interest in presenting material for research. For research, it was all right to have Western clothes, but when the public was to see these people, they weren't to see the way they live now, but the way they used to live.
No people known to us, however hard their lives may be, spend all their time in the acquisition of food and shelter. Even the poorest tribes have produced work that gives them aesthetic pleasure, and those to whom nature has granted freedom from want devote much of their energy to the creation of works of art. It is essential to bear in mind the twofold source of artistic effect. The one based on form alone, the other on ideas associated with the form.
Franz Boas was instrumental in organizing and assembling much of the collection here in the American Museum of Natural History. This is the greatest collection of this kind in the world. There are masks, many dramatic masks of the Kwakiutl and of other tribes, a ceremonial regalia of different sorts, boxes, chests, dishes, beautiful examples of the art of the Northwest Coast. Probably the most spectacular of the Kwakiutl masks are the transformation masks, those masks that were made to change from one form to another. In the firelight, in the atmosphere of the dance house, when the song describes this particular change, the dancer suddenly causes the mask to swing open and expose the inner face, in this case a humanoid eagle, illustrating an actual transformation that's described in the myth of which this is a dramatization. Boas was the first to describe the flat two-dimensional art system of the northern coast in any detail. He was interested in the form of it and in the way it was used to decorate surfaces, as well as the way it was used to illustrate different figures which were significant in the traditions of the people of the Northwest Coast.
The decorative art of the Indians of the Northwest Coast differs from the arts of other primitive people in that the objects mainly represent animals. We may distinguish two principles. First, the animal is characterized by a number of symbols. Second, the artist does not attempt to render a perspective view, but rather to show the whole animal.
This is a bowl bent out of a single plank with an added bottom. It represents a beaver, and here we can see the outline of the eyes in very broad form lines, with the inner ovoid here for the pupil of the eye, and the mouth and the large incisors, which indicate the fact that it is a beaver, and the ears up here. And the beaver's body is continued on around the sides. This large ovoid form here represents the shoulder and the front leg coming here with the claws and other body parts here. He described these forms very objectively, clearly. He recognized very early that this was a highly developed art and that it wasn't just crude surface decoration.
When the artist does a decoration of an animal, he distorts to show the whole body on the decorative field. This originates mainly in the necessity felt by the artist of introducing all the symbols in the decoration. The value of the Museum for Popular Entertainment must not be underrated, particularly in a large city where every attraction that counteracts the influence of the saloon and of the racetrack is of great social importance. We need to show how far each civilization is the outcome of its geographical and historical surroundings. We want a collection arranged according to tribes in order to teach the particular style of each group. Yet it happens that any array of objects is only an exceedingly fragmentary presentation of the true life of a people. All the objects are primarily incidental expressions of complex mental processes that are themselves the subject of anthropological inquiry. Ultimately, the psychological and historical relations of culture cannot be expressed by so small a portion of ethnic life as is presented by objects in museums.
Boas moved steadily away from the public and from public influence on science. He turned from the museum to the university as the institutional home for the future profession of anthropology. And he insisted that that profession be cut off from the untrained amateur element that had formed such an important part of American anthropology as recently as the 1880s. In turning to the university department and in cutting off the amateurs from the profession, Boas profoundly changed the course of American anthropology.
Since I took hold of the work in New York, I have tried to develop a well-organized school of anthropology. I make it a rule to tell every student who proposes to take up anthropology that the chances of finding a position as an anthropologist are very slim. When they insist, there's nothing for me to do but give them the best instruction I can.
Franz Boas had a lifelong interest in the relationship between race and culture. When he worked with the Kwakiutl, he spent a lot of time looking at the way they moved, their motor habits, their patterns of dance, and other forms of expressive culture, so that the film became an avenue into their behavior, a means of looking at the culturally learned ways of moving that these people had, which made them different from other people. He was convinced that racial explanations of behavior were inadequate, and that with this footage he would be able to demonstrate the cultural basis of their dance and their movements. Boas believed that the camera gave him a superior way of understanding behavior. In a way, Boas's belief in the superiority of the camera was a naive belief that somehow film was more realistic and more authentic than other forms of communication. But the belief that the film would allow him to study is certainly one that contemporary researchers would agree with, so that he begins something, a tradition, which is with us today and an important one, an important means of studying human behavior.
The dance problem is difficult. I hope that the films will give me adequate material for making a real study of the style-motor question. The relation between general motor habits and the dance is a complicated matter.
Having Edward Curtis's 1914 epic film on the Kwakiutl to compare with Franz Boas's research footage shot in 1930 of the Kwakiutl allows us a chance to look at two very different, if not opposing, uses of the cinema. To Boas, the cinema and film was a means to study behavior. That is, to record the present conditions, but to look through them and to restore the behavior that was once there in the ethnographic present. For Edward Curtis, on the other hand, cinema was a means to restore and reconstruct behavior for audiences in theaters, so that they might see how the Kwakiutl lived at one time. Curtis needed the image in front of the camera to be as authentic as possible, which required Curtis to spend a great deal of money having all of the materials for the sets built. He had the canoes built, he had the totem poles built, he had the false front houses built, and these were done by authentic Kwakiutl carvers, down to asking every actor in the film to shave their mustaches off, because authentic Kwakiutl never had beards or mustaches, according to Curtis, and to wear wigs because their hair was too short. That is, his concern for authentic detail was quite remarkable for the time. If we compare portions of the two films, it's very easy to see how these differences manifest themselves. For instance, if we look at the cannibal dance, we have with Boas footage for research, therefore footage without context. For Curtis, all of the emphasis is on making the image believable, so that we see something of what it might have been at one time. However, we are looking at Curtis's fantasy of what it might have been, rather than something that actually was occurring at the time. That is, he restored the behavior and reconstructed rather than found it. You have to realize that anthropologists have a very, what's called a my people complex. That is, if you spend a long time working with a particular culture, you have a heavy emotional investment in seeing that your view of them is the dominant one. And of course, anyone who comes along and presents a different view is bound to threaten you. And particularly, I think the relationship between Curtis and Boas must have been a difficult one, because Curtis represented that which Boas was unalterably opposed to, which was the amateur, non-academic anthropologist. There had to be that kind of hostility or antagonism between the two people, because they represent two very different ways of dealing with anthropology. Boas went to Theodore Roosevelt and suggested that Roosevelt convene a committee of respected senior scientific people to look into the credentials of Edward Curtis, with the idea, no doubt, that Boas had of stopping Curtis from continuing his work. From what we can gather, the committee exonerated Curtis, for he continued the rest of his life to complete the study of the North American Indians, and Boas continued to make anthropology a part of the world that he was interested in, that is, the world of museums and universities.
I have the conviction that in certain lines of work, I know exactly what is needed for furthering our knowledge of American ethnology. And I believe that the method which I am pursuing is more systematic than that followed by others. For this reason, I have ventured to concentrate in my hands a considerable part of the ethnological work on our continent. My dear George, what I would like to have is detailed information about what we might call the religion of the Kwakiutl in olden times. You remember we talked a number of times about their old prayers to the sun and the way in which they thought the sun was a kind of god. Whatever you can get on this would be of great interest. You will use the winter months and try to write as much as possible. We are both getting older, and we ought to try to get everything we can relating to the customs of the people.
Dear Dr. Boas, in this mail I send you 9 pages on how the Indians know the sun is the chief of the upper world. I will write some more sun songs and prayers used by the Kwakiutl tribes in the year 1860. Although the Catholic priest tried to show them to pray to God, this they would not believe, for their God is the sun.
In the beginning, it was always hard work to ask about the language. Such a confusion of dialects and languages exists here that the material overwhelms me. The Kwakiutl language is much harder than I thought. I work on the grammar in the mornings. In the afternoons, old fellows tell me stories, and in the evenings, when George Hunt is free, I revise texts with him.
The work with George Hunt is an outstanding example of what Boas accomplished. He wanted to preserve the ways of life of the Indian people in their own words while it was still possible. He trained the people he could. He struggled himself for years to master the unusual sounds, unfamiliar sounds of the languages, and he worked with Indian people as colleagues. He trained someone like George Hunt to write his own language, and George Hunt, as a result, produced many thick volumes of Kwakiutl culture, which are now a major source of what we can know about the traditional way of life of the Kwakiutl.
Boas was probably the first one among all linguists to understand that the paramount importance of linguistic studies was that language is created at the level of the unconscious mind, and that through language we can reach really the most basic properties of the operation of the human mind.
Boas established a standard. He believed that the study of Indian cultures was as important as the study of any cultures in the world, and that language was a crucial part of that. It was central to meaning, and that just as you had to know Chinese or French to study those cultures, you had to know the Indian language to study these. In doing so, he discovered that these languages were as beautiful and as rich in their way as any languages, and that many of the ideas people had about language in general weren't true. They didn't fit these languages. Hiram Smith was born about 1900, so he's just about as old as the century. I first met him in the summer of 1951, and I've been working with him off and on ever since. He was the one I worked most closely with in learning Wasco and working on the grammar and the dictionary of the language and recording texts, too. He is an amazing man in many ways. He's very fluent in English, very oriented toward the world outside the reservation, and yet he has an amazing knowledge of all the localities and all the birds and animals and plants and fish and things that are part of the traditional culture, too. Let me read this to you. Translate it for me, if you would. Kwakiutl Garskim. Dika and Shochwa Anchelaida. Garshoch Ilkach Diksh.
Yeah, well, it came up the Cascade Range, and 3 of the mountains, or girls, you'd say, said, we're going to stay here. We're going to sit here. And they became the 3 sisters.
Kwapt Washlak Galakim Daba Naita Anuslaida.
The mother said, I'm going to sit here. And she became Mount Hood.
What about that?
Few students have considered it necessary to familiarize themselves sufficiently with native languages to understand directly what the people whom they study speak about. Fewer still have deemed it worthwhile to record the customs and beliefs and traditions of the people in their own words, thus giving us objective material which will stand the scrutiny of painstaking investigation.
Mount Hood.
The great thing about Hiram, the thing that's true also of other traditional Indians, is they'll only tell you the things they're sure they know.
I enjoy teaching the Wasco language. I've worked with Dell for about 25 years now on this language deal.
Are there other people who speak Wasco?
Oh, there's a few. Few of my people speak it on the reservation. Not too many anymore. There's some on the Columbia, along the Columbia River that speaks it. My tribe's all gone. There ain't many left now.
Most intensive work is immediately required because the knowledge is rapidly vanishing.
He was the very first, as a linguist, to understand that it was impossible to describe exotic languages using the traditional framework used by linguists for Indo-European languages, and it was necessary to invent, to create a new framework for each particular language which was being studied. And this carried a very important lesson for all of us, not only for linguists, because the same is true in the field of social organization, in the field of religion, in the field of art. We have to really invent a new frame of reference and try to avoid imposing an outside frame of reference on new material.
About 1910 or a little before, there was a good deal of consideration in this country as to whether we should allow all the people of Europe from the different parts of Europe to come in here. And so a commission was appointed by the Senate to investigate this matter, different populations of Europe which were acceptable and which were less acceptable. At the time, there were 42 reports written by different people, presumably some of them scientists and other people. And so Boas used instruments, calipers, and all kinds to measure the various parts of the body, and then to develop very large statistical tables. It was really the important base of an advanced study of physical anthropology that was developed during that time.
Investigation of a large number of families has shown that every single measurement that we made and studied has one value among individuals born in Europe and another among individuals of the same families born in America. It is remarkable that the change in head form of American-born individuals occurs almost immediately after the arrival of their parents in this country. These observations indicate that the mental makeup of man may be considerably influenced by a social and geographical environment rather than race. We do not yet know what produces changes in human types. The old idea of absolute stability must be given up, and with it, the belief in the hereditary superiority of certain types over others. Among us, race antagonism is a fact, and we should try to understand its psychological significance.
Boas was one of the first prominent Jews in the United States to recognize that there was an advantage for Jews to defend and assist the black people in this country. He tried to shift the main focus of anthropological research from the North American Indian to the black people here in the United States and elsewhere in the world. By shifting to blacks, Boas was making a significant break in anthropology. He wanted to study a people who lived here within white society, whereas anthropologists had historically studied peoples who lived outside the boundaries of white society. Now, why did Boas want to look at race in a new way? Why did Boas want to make these shifts to blacks? One, Boas believed that science could help in important ways to solve important social and political problems. That's debatable, but he believed that. Second, Boas was a Jew born and raised in Germany who had suffered anti-Semitic discrimination and persecution in Germany and later here in the United States. The new way of looking at race was a way of attacking and discrediting racial and religious prejudice, including anti-Semitism. How successful was Boas in achieving his unique goals? Not very. It was not until the triumph of Hitler and his racist philosophy that the Boasian point of view became more widely accepted, because then the Boasian point of view coincided with the new domestic and foreign policies of the United States.
I can still remember quite vividly what happened on that day, December 21st, 1942. Boas invited a few persons to a luncheon with Rivet at the faculty club at Columbia University. It was an extremely cold day, as a matter of fact, one of the coldest days I can remember. And Boas arrived early from his home, his Grantwood, on the other side of the Hudson. He was wearing, I remember, a very dilapidated and discolored fur cap, which probably dated back to his time with the Eskimo 50 years earlier. Boas was in very high spirits, and luncheon started quite gaily. And then, all of a sudden, Boas was struck by something like an electric shock. He pushed violently and fell backward on the ground with his chair. And I was seated by his side, and immediately I tried to help him, but he was dead. And we all left struck with sorrow and with the feeling that we had the sad privilege to witness the passing out of one of the very last intellectual giants, such as the 19th century was able to produce, and whom probably will not be produced anymore.
In my opinion, laws of cultural development, as rigid as the laws of physics are supposed to be, are unattainable. Absolute laws for phenomena as complex as those of culture are impossible. There will always be reflections of our own culture.
This program was produced by Public Broadcasting Associates, Boston, which is solely responsible for its contents. For a transcript, send $3 to Odyssey, Box 1000, Boston, Massachusetts, 02118. Major funding for Odyssey was provided by National Endowment for the Humanities. Additional funding was provided by